Hello everyone, my name's Josh, and I'm going to be talking about an issue that I think is kind of overdressed environmentally, and it began in the 1970s. Now in the 1970s, America started becoming more environmentally conscious. We ended the predator war, and in 1971 we put into the act the Wild and Free Roaming Horse and Burro Act. And I'm here to say that that act poses more harm than good. And I'm going to begin with a brief history of horses on this continent. Now, the horse began life here ancestrally during the Pleistocene era on this continent, and that era ended about 14 to 10,000 years ago. Now, the horses that of today, its ancestors migrated out of this country via the Bering Land Bridge, and what was left here was either overhunted by man, hunters arriving, men arriving to this continent and overhunted them, and the change in climate and transition into the Holocene. Now, the horses that evolved outside of America, that continent, they spread all over Eurasia, Africa, which also turned into zebras and etc. And it wasn't until about the 1500s, 1520, I think is the rough estimate, that Dan Flores gives in his book, American Serengeti, is when their horses arrived back to this continent. Now, granted, they evolutionarily came here, there's about a 10 to 14,000 gap in which these animals, major predators, have all been also erased through the transition into the Pleistocene and into the Holocene. Now, that being said, that would make the feral horse actually an invasive species. Granted, it's had about 500 years being on this continent. All of its major predators are gone, excluding man and the mountain lion, which is one thing that's going to be addressed. Now, the population growth of feral horse populations is about 9 to 20% annually, and that is an estimate that it actually comes out of the influence of predation by mountain lions, written by Turner John and Michael Morrison. Now they did a study and they found the correlation of horse populations matched exactly with mountain lion populations. And now the big issue with that being having that large surplus of mountain lions at the same time, granted their populations are going up and down together. When there's a high level of mountain lions, they also hunt at their ungulates. Now ungulates are deer, elk, and antelope and sheep. And deer is not so much an issue. California has about a 75,000 bounty on deer annually for hunters. Elk, not so much. They are coming back, but our bighorn sheep are definitely an endangered species, and they are being targeted heavily by mountain lion hunting. Now, also, with the larger populations comes overgrazing and competition for resources such as watering holes and watering springs. And that's another thing that's driving out ungulates. And it really affected for hunting grounds. And what's important about that is when you're driving out ungulates out of hunting is America's #1 source of conservation, which generates about 60% of America's conservation efforts. And then lastly, I'm going to touch base on, this is probably the biggest topic, is the act impedes from effective management of these animals that are out there. The Bureau of Land Management, and this information can be seen from the National Horse and Burro Rangeland Management Coalition. They received about $80 million and spend about $80 million annually, which isn't really a lot of money. But because of those rising populations of feral animals, the biggest expense of that, about $15 million, is spent on holding facilities for animals that cannot be released on rangelands. And with that, you're seeing a host of animals also facing starvation in the wild, dehydration, and it's really becoming an issue because the act, as it's been gone through the years, it's been updated. They can no longer euthanize sick animals. They can't go out there and send them out for adoption. They used to be able to adopt out or send them to slaughter facilities for sick animals. But the last, Boner Taylor writes a correlation about that, and who was a University of Tennessee, who writes a correlation about the slaughterhouse's closure in relation to rising horse populations. And he was able to point out, because of this, those horses that are in holding facilities are seeing a higher level of neglect and abuse out of it, just because there's no really range space for them, and most of the time it's a male horse that's being kept. Typically the mares are adopted out. Adoption levels were cut down. A private owner can now only really adopt up to 4 horses, out of fear of the horse being sold to either Canada or Mexico, where they still have slaughter facilities. Now, because of this, the Act has impeded the Bureau of Land Management's ability to maintain these herds. Right now, the most effective way they have of doing it is going out using contraceptives on populations, which is having a slight effect of it, but not so much as, honestly, if they were to open hunting or completely relieve the Act, pull the Act up for these animals. But no senator wants to be known as the person to butcher a horse. That is my case, and hope you all enjoyed it.
Best drives.
All right, Josh, I think there's a good argument in here that kind of gets buried in some other information that you're sharing.
Okay.
You know, the whole historical information about invasive species, about the history of them appearing and disappearing and reappearing here. I don't know that it accomplishes much for you.
Okay.
I mean, there's maybe a little bit of context for us, but other than that, it doesn't really show that the act that we're talking about works or doesn't work or has a harmful consequence. And because you get kind of bogged down in explaining the relationship between the horses and the predators and the other species that might be pursued by those predators, it's less clear than it should be. You know, counting the number of mountain lions that go up and down with the number of horses, which is then correlated to the number of deer and antelope that are hunted, and then the hunting is, you know, this is our major conservation effort. I'm going, yeah, how does this all work? I think there's an argument here, but it's kind of buried in relationships between information that are not as clearly explained as they need to be, and some of which are probably not relevant to the argument that you're making. I think the essence of your argument is that the rule changes that have been in place because of this act and the modifications of the act have prevented us from effectively managing the wild horse population. Mm-hmm. That's what your claim is. So why is that the case? What are we not allowed to do that we used to be able to do? Talk about that. Why that's a bad thing, why it creates a harm, get to that point. Then show how it has this long-term impact to the rest of the ecosystem. That would be the way to go about it. Okay. So in other words, there's a chain of arguments here. I don't think you've got your information in the form of a chain. I think it's, you know, kind of clustered around, and I don't see the connection between those points, and that makes it a little bit harder to figure out the point that you're ultimately trying to get across. There's factual data about the rule changes. There's some statistical data about the horse populations. There's some factual data about how much is spent on this. And I think at the end you do have a legitimate point to say, you know, people may not want to change the rules because then it sounds like they are in favor of wiping out the horses, and no senator wants to be in that particular position. There's a political consideration on this as well, and maybe the argument is that the political considerations have interfered with effective management of these wild horse populations. Then I think that you could even more clearly draw a chain of arguments on these points. As it is, it just feels like there's something in here, but it's digging it out is harder than it should be. And in an oral presentation, it needs to be relatively simple. Okay. It needs to be pretty straightforward. You know, it's not that there's anything in your speech that's bad. It's just not as clear as it needs to be. And that's a problem for a speech. At the end result is that people aren't quite sure what it is that is the point of your argument and how did you get there. They're probably just going to pass it off and move on to the next thing instead of, you know, consider the possibility that you were right on that.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.